Hi, Misha here, and we're continuing to talk about, and you're continuing to look at British tanks. And last time we looked at the tank cruiser Mark 6, although we also talked about the Mark 5, the Mark 5 being known as the Coventer, the Mark 6 being known as the Crusader. One of the first kind of its type to really go into production, the Mark 1, 2, 3. They made a few hundred total, but they made over 5,300 of these. But it was of limited use, really only in North Africa, 1941, 1942, and a little bit into 43. But they needed something better. Actually, the original idea was to upgun, going from the 2-pounder to the 6-pounder, although in reality they would end up going to the Qf6 Today we're going to talk about the tank cruiser Mark 7 and the tank cruiser Mark 8. However, we're actually talking about 3 designs, all originally known as Cromwell. Cromwell Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3. Also A24, A27L, A27M, later split up into the Cavalier, the Centaur, and the Cromwell. And of course, amongst those, we have Mark 1, 2, 3, Centaurs, Cromwells, and of course, this would evolve into the Comet, which we'll talk about in a different video. If you think this is confusing and will give me a headache, you are 100% right. The things I do for you guys. With that, let's delve in. I'm going to line these up to kind of represent the 3 different design paths here. These are all 1/72 scale die cast. Like I said in the first video, this is from Atlas or Altea or D'Agostini. They do the same. The middle one here is actually from Americum, and it's one of their better efforts. I'm actually think it's pretty neat. And over here, we have another one from D'Agostini or any of that stuff. But this kind of represents the paths. Because in 1940, the Crusader was going into service, and they already knew they needed something with more armor and a larger gun. The Brits really liked their 2-pounder, but finally by 1940-41, they were acknowledging they needed to go to the Qf6 Pounder. Now, they'd actually developed it before the war, but never really produced it or put it on tanks. And they thought this would be the first tank it would go on. As it turned out, it was actually the Crusader Mark III, because this whole thing was taking more time than they had intended. They laid out specifications in 1940, and in January of 1941, they picked a winner. Now, we had a few different companies submitting designs. You had Nuffield, which essentially just submitted a improved cruiser with a bigger turret, able to take a larger gun, bigger ring. This would become the A24, first known as the Cromwell 1. And then you had English Electric, later Leyland. They would submit what would become known as the A27L, initially the Cromwell 2. This used the same Liberty engine, but it did have a new gearbox, steering system, and it was a little more advanced, but still using an upgraded version of the Liberty. So it's kind of the middle of the road. Cromwell 3, later known as the A27M, was actually submitted by Birmingham, and it was the most radical. It had a new engine, and it also used the new gearbox and had new suspension, and it was the most far-flung, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. They really didn't have a lot of faith in it, at least some, to the point that even though they agreed to let it try out with the new engine, they wanted to make sure it was reverse compatible with the Liberty. Liberty was not a great engine by 1940 standards because it was dating really back to World War I, but it was in production. It's what they had. And that's actually why in January they selected the A24 from Nuffield. Even though it was the least advanced and least forward-thinking, it used the most off-the-shelf components, and they thought they could have it in service by 1942. So it was accepted and adopted as the Tank Cruiser Mark VII, still known as the Cromwell at this time. And 6 prototypes were ordered, and they were supposed to be ready by early to winter or spring of 1942. In any event, they were behind schedule and will not deliver it until the summer of 1942, and were terribly underwhelming. As it's still known at this time, the A24, the Cromwell 1, proved underpowered and just not much of an advancement over the Crusader, because essentially the rear was like this Crusader here, this kind of rear box system. Had a few updates. Again, it has a little bit more advanced engine. The main thing was it was using this new style of turret. So, in the interim, some work had been done. Talking about the Centaur, well, that progressed forward, and prototypes were ready, known as Cromwell 2, A27L. And so they were ready for testing. It was, a little more advanced, but not much to really say about it. It kind of went at a pace. But the Cromwell 3, that's where really things were going well. Back in 1940, they were recovering Merlin engines from crashed Spitfires. And Rolls-Royce worked on making a ground version. This would evolve into the Meteor. They actually had to derate it because it was just too much for a tank. And so this work would begin at Rolls-Royce, although actual production of the Meteor engine would be transferred to Rover in 1942, with production starting off in the end of that year. And this was really where things were shining. The Mark III Cromwell really was doing well, and was really exceeding expectations. So prototypes were ready. The problem, they didn't have enough Merlin engines until 1943, and by that point they were ready to put the Centaur up against the Cromwell. As I should mention, this is when the naming conventions will get changed. They realized how confusing it is, so they split the Cromwell 1 becoming the Cavalier, Cromwell 2 becoming the Centaur, and the Cromwell 3 becoming our tank here, the Cromwell. So you got to keep the name because it was kind of looking best. The Cavalier, they would produce about 500 in 1942 alone, and that was really it. These are mostly just kept for the home guard, auxiliary, secondary things, training, what have you. That was a dead end because it just wasn't pushing far enough. Speaking of, things had taken so long that Qf6 Pounder that looked so good in 1940-41, but 1943 was looking a little outdated. It would be used on these new tanks, some, but they would end up boring it out and changing it over to becoming the Qf75. And actually the Qf6 was a better anti-tank gun, higher velocity, but the Sherman had shown the 75mm was a good all-around kind of medium velocity, multi-purpose, had better heat, had better high explosive, just more of an all-around good thing. They had wanted to just use the Sherman's gun in the tank, but they had to make their own gun to fit the turret, but they could use the American shells more or less as is. So, by 1943, we've got deliveries, and there's going to be a tank-off starting that August between the Centaur with an upgraded Liberty engine and the new gear system from Brown, and the Cromwell with the new Meteor engine, and it also uses the new gearbox, and it has new suspension and a few other things as well. So which is going to kind of prove best? They would compete against each other along with Crusaders and even some Cavaliers as more of a control between late summer and early fall. And the Centaur pretty much performed as they expected. It was sluggish using the old engine. The new turret did work well enough, but of course it was the Cromwell that was the star of the show. They tweaked it a little bit, kind of submitted a revised version in November, December for final testing. It did even better. This is where they had to actually derate the engine. It could get over 40 miles per hour, which just wasn't great for a lot of things. A lot of wear and tear on the parts, a lot of wear and tear on the crew. So they rated it down to about 30 to 32 miles per hour. Exceedingly good for a tank, and it had a lot of good attributes. The Merlin, now the Meteor engine, was just well respected, and Rover is able to produce enough. Now they're trying to get enough Qf6 guns. So obviously this is what they're doing. Now they do produce a good number of Centaurs, and this is where things get really confusing, because the difference between a Centaur and a Cromwell is the engine. Centaur has the Liberty, Cromwell has the Meteor. There are a lot of external differences, but they're not across the board. For example, English Electric produced Cromwells, but they used a Centaur spec hull a little bit. Most of the changes were literally under the hood or under the suspension, and you can't even really tell. For example, on these two models, you'll notice there's this kind of right here thing in the back of the Cromwell, this hood or for the ventilation for the engine. Typically, you'll see Cromwells with that, and like this one here, Centaurs, they have the vents back there, but not that hood. But that's not 100% the case. There are Centaurs that have it, and there are Cromwells that don't. The hull gunner position is the same way. A lot of times you see Centaurs that don't have it, but the truth is, early Cromwells, they removed it as well, and some late Centaurs could have it. And of course, there's the guns we can talk about. And there's changes to the armor plate, the storage boxes. Yeah, we'll get into that. But anyway, what do we have here? Lengthwise, it's just about the same as the Crusader, just under 21 feet. It is a heavier tank, about 27 to 28 tons. Keep in mind, it's also faster. Early versions would have about 3 inches, so about 75 millimeters armor at the thickest. Later versions, this would bump up to about 100 millimeters, 4 inches. Pretty good for a cruiser tank. And we had the machine gun coaxially located with the gun and the turret, which was a 3-man turret again. Now, again, the hull machine gunner position, it was there, but plated over, especially early versions. Later, it could be there or not be there, depending. And they would go to wider tracks sometimes, and just other little things. And lots of Centaurs were later upgraded with the Meteor engine as it was available. So I think you kind of see that the line is essentially blurred so much that for models especially, there's really no telling them apart. But the Centaur, the ones that were kept at the Liberty, they were pretty much just home guard. Only a few saw service, and those were the close support versions, the CS, which is actually what we have here. Now, as far as the guns for the Cromwell, because they were still getting the Qf6 in, it would be the main gun. About 60% or nearly 2/3 would have it, but about 30%, 1/3, would be equipped with either the older Qf6 or some other high-velocity anti-tank gun. And 10% would have the Qf95, which was a howitzer, essentially, for launching smoke, canisters, and other things to support the infantry. So you had a ratio of armament there. Like the Crusader, it would carry nearly 5,000 rounds of 7.9 millimeter for the Beza machine gun or machine guns. yeah, so it really was an evolution of the design, and it shows. And if it just been the Centaur, we would have had a little bit better steering and gear system, a little more reliable. But because of the Meteor engine, we get just much better performance, and we're able to haul around a bigger gun. They even worked with fitting it with the 17-pounder, the 76.2 millimeter. But that kind of leads to next video and the next tank. For now, even though these are supposed to be in service by 1942, we're into 1944. In February, the final spec, known as the Battle Cromwell, is done, and several factories will be building these, so they are in service before D-Day. I'm not actually sure if this is supposed to be a Centaur or a Cromwell, because even though it has a lot of Centaur features, or lack thereof, some websites call it a Cromwell, others just call it a Mark IV, which isn't terribly helpful because there's a Mark IV Centaur and a Mark IV Cromwell. It does have the 95 millimeter close support howitzer. It has this kind of counterweight on the muzzle, and doesn't have the forward hull machine gun position. Again, those were often plated over on early Cromwells and Centaurs, but the spot was always there. So, by 1944, ready for service, and would be shipped over for armored reconnaissance units and other forward units in Europe, and would be available for D-Day. Now, the Centaur was kept at home and never saw combat except for this version here, the close support. These would actually be used to support the Royal Marines during landings on D-Day. So I think that's why this could be considered a Centaur, because I think it is dated 1944. Either way, it's kind of neat. If it's a Cromwell, kind of the same thing, because there was a 95 millimeter gun fitted to the Cromwell close support as well. But that was it for the Centaur's combat. Most all of them were later either retired or re-engined with the Meteor. And again, those Cromwells that came out of English Electric looked more like Centaurs anyway, including having the old school style suspension. Notice this one doesn't have the guards coming down all the way on the tracks. Also, my rubber's a little there to fix that. Oh well. These are inexpensive little tanks, but it's neat. I was happy when it came in with the stubby big gun. Kind of just a neat thing. It does move up and down. And the hull is metal. The turret's plastic on this one. Tracks are rubber. And it's a little plinth. And there we go. The thing is, this took so long to come into service that it was, I don't want to say obsolete, but it was getting there, frankly. And here we have it with the Qf6 This was the most common gun found on the Cromwell. And these would serve from D-Day on through Europe and marching into Germany. They were faster, more maneuverable than the Sherman. They had a lower silhouette, lower profile, which is, good in the sense that it's harder to hit. But they were a little more cramped interior, even with the new turret. And this one does have the forward hull-mounted machine gun. They tended to retain these more and more towards the end of production. And production would not last that long, but several factories would build it. Between 1944 and 1945, they would turn out over 4,000. So a pretty impressive number. And they would stay in service in England through the Korean War and even through the 50s, finally being fully retired out by 1960, give or take. Of course, by this point, they were used for training or secondary stuff. It was a good tank. I mean, they had 4 inches of armor, but it wasn't really sloped armor. That was a bit of a thing. But the Meteor engine really upped its game. The crews liked it. It was fun. It was had some get up and go And they would make some minor changes and improvements, adding better protection, and storage would change around a bit. But it took so long to get to service, and technology progressed. And of course, they wanted to fit it with a true high-velocity gun, because this Qf6 was considered a medium-velocity dual-purpose gun. They wanted to go to a high-velocity, and that would end up being the next tank, so we'll talk about that. It would be used a little bit outside of the UK. Israel would have some. They would be used in the Greek Civil War. And they would make their way into Africa some. It's neat enough. It is neat enough. But, of course, yeah, they had places to go with that. So, next time, we will talk about the Comet. Until then, this is Misha. Please do feel free to comment, and if you could, please like, share, subscribe, and all that other good stuff. Catch you next time.